Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Fly podcast. I'm again joined by Master Sanders to discuss the problems with dominionism. Over the past few episodes we've done together, and also in some private discussions, we've been sort of highlighting the problems with modern Christianity and why it's been so unsuccessful, singularly ineffective. And one of the things that we've sort of focused in on is this concept of dominionism, which, while certainly in recent memory is often associated with the Christian right, I think can with equal and maybe even better reason be attributed to the Christian left, with things like the social gospel and some of the globalist leanings of someone like an N.T. Wright. But this idea that Christians need to sort of impose their will on the world through corporations or NGOs or political institutions, civil government, seems to be one of the main goals of a lot of these Christian movements on the right and the left, taking up an exorbitant amount of time and effort, and ultimately not yielding very many results, at least not very many positive results. And I think probably the best place to start would be maybe a brief survey of the history of dominionism. So I know, Master Sanders, you've looked into that a lot recently. So why don't you sketch out sort of brief history of where these two strands of dominionism come from?
Yes, as you alluded to, the dominionism has a very interesting history. Of course, there's always been, or at least within the past 1700 years of Western history, the idea that Christianity should be wedded to the state, or that Christians should have some control over the state. That has been common since Constantine in one form or another. So that's not necessarily what we're talking about with dominionism. Dominionism is a sort of Protestant phenomenon that seeks to bring earthly institutions under the control of Christians, and by extension, Christ. So it's not just families and churches, obviously, but also civil institutions like government, schools, businesses, etc. It has an interesting twin origin, both of which can be found in the 19th century. One obviously was in the Netherlands with the works and writings of Abraham Kuyper, a prominent Dutch politician and theologian at the time, who argued for this idea of sphere sovereignty, that there were certain spheres within public life, such as the church, such as the state and the home, and within these spheres there's a certain level of sovereignty, but even then they're all to be subjected unto Christ. He says, to sort of paraphrase him, he says there's nothing within human life that Christ does not scream mine. But also you have within the left tradition people within the social gospel movement that sought to realize, in many ways, the teachings of Jesus in a tangible social way. Probably one of the most famous articulates of that, other than people like notable liberals such as Rosenbusch, but probably Charles Sheldon might have actually had the clearest articulation of a social gospel in his fiction, In His Steps, which is one of the most widely read books in the English language. And what both of these movements share in common is this, of course, not only to bring institutions within human life into subjection to Christ, but also this sort of idea of postmillennialism and a preteristic interpretation of Revelation. Within postmillennialism, there's this, of course, this idea that Christians are going to bring about the golden age, that Christians will bring about the millennium and bring about Christ's reign that way. And so that will be how Christ will return. And while we kind of see it now as being an aspect of wing Calvinists, it's actually it was used prominent on the left as well. And in fact, throughout a lot of American history, postmillennialism in one form or another was the rule of the day throughout various theological strains. Dominionism is also very tricky, as you've sort of alluded to earlier, Todd, in terms of pinning down, because it's become so pervasive across traditions within Protestantism. Now, Dominionism, I think, was originally coined in reference to the ideas of R.J. Rushdoony, which we've talked about before. Rushdoony, of course, was a theonomist, and he also wanted to see Christians take over these institutions and bring them into subjection to Christ. But dominionism took on a whole broader meaning outside of just a strict Calvinist theonomy, but instead came to just and simply include conservative Christian politicians who may want to emphasize America's Christian heritage. So I don't think people like Mike Pence or Ted Cruz would necessarily be considered, theonomists, but these sort of soft dominionists are still well within the dominionist philosophy. And even though dominionism has been sort of a vague term coined by the left to kind of straw man and boogeyman a lot of people on the right, it's probably the best all-encompassing term we have to include all of these disparate traditions with their commonalities.
Yeah, exactly. And when we look at, say, and today for like on the left, a classic example of this might be N.T. Wright, whose commentary on Romans, he talks about the need for Christians to collaborate with a global institution of law enforcement for social justice. Sounds an awful lot like the Antichrist regime of Revelation 17, but whatever. One of the things that happens, so if we look at the first two iterations of dominionism, they failed. The sort of Kuyperian, right-wingish dominionism isn't really that influential in Holland today. It certainly, I don't know exactly when, but it looks like it failed sometime before World War II. And the social gospel, which culminated with the nationwide ban on alcohol, which led to the explosion of organized crime, kind of blew up in its face, leading to a diminution of the social gospel until much later. Probably the evangelical left probably really gets going in the 70s and 80s as a parallel resistance to the religious right. It's just the time that American politics had a more right-wing dimension to it. So you had in the 70s, you had Ford and Bush and Reagan. And so they didn't look as influential. Their time came with Obama. But when you look at it, though, it failed, and it failed in rather spectacular ways. One could argue that the right-wing theonomists haven't yet had their chance to even try for a play. So I guess you could say they failed only in the sense that they haven't even got their chance to go to bat. Whereas the left-wing social gospel types failed by the end of the 1920s. Once people had saw the sort of disaster. And that tends to be a common theme. These sort of millenarian, post-millennial reform movements tend to overshoot. And then and in the process of overshooting, they then look bad for a generation or so. And then people sort of denounce them and sort of distance themselves from them. And then maybe, after a third or fourth generation has passed where people don't even remember them anymore, they might crop up again and say, hey, we have answers to these social problems. And I think the fundamental reason why they keep on collapsing in on themselves and failing is because the social problems that they identify, they may even identify correctly, but they're using tools that are not really meant to be used to solve these problems. So let's go for the example of alcohol abuse, substance abuse, which led to prohibition. That's a spiritual problem, and it's one that's not easily or even ideally addressed by the state. George Washington said the state is like fire. It's a useful tool, but dangerous. But it was limited. You could only do so much with the power of the state. So whether it's the power of the state or in modern days, NGOs for the left and corporations for the right, these are tools that are not capable of dealing with the kinds of social ills that they're attempting to solve using those tools. And I think that's a fundamental flaw in this dominionist mentality.
Well, yes. Well, one thing about the Netherlands, there to us, I don't know if Kuyper ever attempted to create an entire Protestant superstate over the Netherlands, but he certainly was in support of creating institutions for Protestants within the Netherlands. And so in the Netherlands, you had this phenomenon called pillarization, where depending on your political or cultural leanings, you have certain institutions that you go to. So if you're a Protestant, you go to the Protestant hospital. If you're Catholic, you go to the Catholic hospital. If you're a socialist, you go to the socialist hospital, or you go to the socialist school, or what have you. And although this is somewhat disintegrating, that may be the only lasting thing that Kuyper has done within the Netherlands. But today, the Netherlands is unfortunately an increasingly secular society. One nation that probably took in his ideas the most and took them seriously might actually have been South Africa. And one can argue that the apartheid system, with its emphasis on separate development, may have had some influence from Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, which unfortunately didn't quite work out in any sort of humane way in that sense. And nowadays, South Africa is far more of a secular state after apartheid. But going back to what you were saying, yeah, I think that when you look at dominionism in its various forms, it's typically a reaction to pietism. Oh, excuse me. It's a reaction to pietism, and there was an attempt, I think, by people like Kuyper and probably people like Sheldon to bring Christianity out of a sort of monkish, individualistic, mystic sense and try to address problems in the here and now, which I can say is, definitely a noble idea. And I think there are problems with being too pietistic in that sense. But the problem is I think you alluded to, is that dominionists tend to go in the opposite extremes and overcorrect. And so whereas, a pietist may say all problems are ultimately spiritual and exclusively spiritual, dominionists, whether they acknowledge it or not, almost make all these problems that are spiritual social. And when these problems are entirely social, the state becomes the state becomes a legitimate tool to bring about Christ's dominion and reform the lives of individuals. And, the state does have a role in punishing evil, I think, as Paul says in Romans 13. But even then, that has its limits when it comes to its effectiveness. In the end, the state can only do so much when it comes to the spiritual life. It can only punish sin after the fact. Christianity has to have some level of spiritual transformation in the lives of individuals and in families and in churches, which can ultimately solve this problem on a permanent basis. And so I think, in short, dominionism tends to emphasize the physical over the spiritual in a way that pietism may emphasize the spiritual over the physical.
Exactly. Now, in the modern 20th and 21st century American political scene, dominionism is, with regards to its right-wing variant, we could argue begins with Rushdoony. And one of the things that these dominionists will often refer to is, of course, Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28, where we read about, God giving man this dominion mandate. So in Genesis 1:28, then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now, in that context, the process by which dominion is taken is through procreation. That's the verb in taking dominion. But when we look at this is a pre-fall command before man sinned and brought creation into subjection, as Paul would say in Romans. And it's detailing man's relationship to the animal kingdom and to the physical world. So it's really difficult to see how you're going to get from Genesis 1, a pre-fall mandate, to man, which details man's relationship to the physical world and the living creatures that God created to fill it, and then man's relationship to man. Because if you listen to the right-wing dominionists, man's relationship to animals in the created order is almost completely absent from all of their writings. Rushdoony does not spend much time writing about how to treat animals and environmental considerations. Rushdoony spends most of his time talking about man's relationship to man. And the problem that I see is you just can't get that from Genesis 1. There are no civil institutions in existence in Genesis chapter 1 because there is no need for civil institutions. And so taking something that tells us how to relate to animals and the environment and then taking it to mean controlling civil institutions just seems very problematic. Now, it would seem to me that the sort of unstated assumption for these right-wing dominionists is that the dominion we have is the dominion that Christ has over the earth. So we read in Revelation that Christ will have dominion over all the nations. And they'll be like, yeah, and we're the ones that are going to give him that dominion by taking it. And, okay, I mean, but trying to link those two together is more of an assumption. I haven't really seen them try to link it. And, again, the problem seems to be that there just isn't, not only is there not that much talked about with regards to taking control of civil institutions at all in the scriptural text, it's difficult to envision how you could even derive that from it.
It really is, and that's made even more complicated by, when Jesus said in the Gospel of John that he said, "My kingdom is not of this world; otherwise, my disciples would have fought." And even in Matthew, Jesus says that dominion has been given to me. It's the fact is that we're not trying to bring everything into the subjection of Christ. It's already under the subjection of Christ. Even when Satan, attempted to tempt Jesus with the kingdoms of this world, it's already become apparent that Jesus is already in dominion over these things. Now, this gets into some complicated questions about eschatology, which I don't think we have time for today, but we have talked about in the past. I think the problem is with postmillennialism in general and preterism is that you have to bring a whole lot of assumptions into it that the text doesn't necessarily give you. Occam's razor kind of just tells you that usually the simplest is probably the most correct, and the simplest interpretation of some of these passages, as I think we've talked about in streams in the past, seems to indicate a more premillennial view, which if premillennialism is the teaching of the Bible, then that means that Christians will have little to nothing to bringing about Christ's kingdom on earth. Christ is going to do it himself. And I think the rest of the text in both the Old and New Testament seem to suggest that. I believe that most within this worldview hold to a sort of replacement theology or supersessionism, where the church has taken the place of Israel, and now the church is doing Israel's work. And that's why a lot of things such as baptism is tied back to, especially with infant baptism, is tied back to the concept of circumcision as being analogous to it, and some of these other aspects. You don't see within the Torah, God telling Israel to take dominion over the earth. They were going to destroy the Canaanites, obviously, but even then, there wasn't this idea that the Israelites were going to terraform the Holy Land or terraform Canaan and bring it into subjection of God. God said the land is mine, present tense, and God says that He's going to give the Israelites everything. He's going to give them the vineyards they didn't plant and the wells they didn't dig. So everything, there's nothing that the Israelites can say that they did outside of their obedience to God. Everything else that God has provided for them. So we don't even see this sort of dominion aspect in terms of taking over the nations outside of God, telling them to clear the land of the Canaanites, which you would think if the church is basically analogous to Israel in such a very strict way that many, particularly right-wing dominionists, insist.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the left-wing flavor of dominionism today will lay some superficial stress on animal rights and environmental issues, but that's always more of a sort of buzzword for a deeper Marxism, right? There's that saying that the environmentalist movement is like, Marxism is like a watermelon today. It's green on the outside, but red on the inside. And I think this is where we get to the key critique of dominionism. Of its right and left varieties, even more fundamental than it being a sort of political platform. Dominionism is an economic system. So left-wing dominionism tends towards socialism, and they're going to get that from a certain reading of the four Gospels. And right-wing dominionism is going to converge on a kind of right-wing libertarianism based off of a certain reading of the Tanakh. But, of course, the patently absurd thing is that you're not going to read the Tanakh and get Murray Rothbard. You're not going to read the Gospels and get Karl Marx. Yet that's exactly what these people try to do. And so what we see, what on paper sounds theoretically like a fresh new take on, the stifling, binary right-left view of politics in the Western world is nothing other than a creative baptizing of both. And so this problem of pretending to transcend the right-left paradigm is really deceptive because, well, the right libertarians don't pretend to be transcending anything, so they're not being dishonest here. It's the left dominionists that are being dishonest who pretend to transcend it. But neither one of them is offering a truly unique, fresh take on this, but they're merely just baptizing already existing economic orders, libertarianism, and socialism.
Well, and here's the thing about creating a third way. I think there could theoretically be a Christian, biblically based third way, but it would look very, very different than any of those two systems that you've described. I think what the big problem with both sides, and both right-wing and left-wing dominionists, is that they often just get half the equation. And when you only get half the equation, that opens the door for supplementing it with something else. Like, right-wing dominionists tend to supplement it consciously or unconsciously with Rothbard, whereas left-wing dominionists tend to substitute with Marx. So let's take the issue of the Old Testament law when it comes to sexual morality. You have, of course, those on the right that would say that sexual morality is very important to God, and he punishes nations for it. Then you have the left wing that would say, people like J.D. Greer, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, says that God whispers about sexual sin, and they'll say that God's more concerned about economic sin. Well, the problem is they are both correct. The Bible does have a preponderance of material on sexual sin and on economic sin. The thing is, what none of them tend to get is that that both of them are interconnected. So, for example, why are the Israelites in the Old Testament sacrificing their children to Baal and to Molech? Well, it's so that they can get better crop yields, so they could have success in having more children. Sex and money have a very strong connection with each other, and you see that as like one sin going in hand with the other. Another is the issue of the sin of Sodom. The sin of Sodom actually has two components to it. When you talk about sodomy, it's often thought about just purely in sexual terms, like when it comes to, obviously, the men of Sodom wanting to rape the two angels that came by to visit them. But there's also an Ezekiel reference to the sin of Sodom being their lack of generosity, right? So these two, which if you think about it, if your immediate reaction to a stranger in your homeland is to rape them, I mean, that shows you that you don't have a sense of generosity. The point being is that both of these sins are intertwined, and you can't deal with one without having to touch on the other. And we're seeing that play out in our neoliberal society, where commercialism and sexual degeneracy are going hand in hand and are propping up each other. And you're right. And going back to, if you only get half the equation, it's going to be easier to find something else to supplement it, such as Rothbard or Marx. And we're not really going to come up with an effective Christian third way, if that's what we think is desirable, unless we are willing to confront those passages in the Bible that may not fit with our economic or political persuasion.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost really too bad there wasn't this secular dystopian author that mentioned how consumerism and sexual perversion would come together to create a dystopian totalitarian future. It's too bad that book wasn't written,
I know, right?
But The other problem too is in the effort to fight spiritual problems with these sort of material tools of the state, et cetera, we have a problem of incentives. So if we look at Sun Tzu says that war is deception, and so one must be very deceptive to be a successful warrior. And we see this throughout military history again and again. Now, if we view politics, and war is politics by other means, and I suppose by implication, politics is war by other means. And if you especially look at the landscape in America today, the increasing polarization of it, what the kind of traits that one would have to cultivate to be a successful CEO, to make enough money to be competitive, to be an influencer that the theonomists want, or to be, politically successful, to be an influencer. Paul says that the Christians should put away lying from one another. And in a society where a lot of people still profess to be Christians, and you're lying to them, either for corporate gain or political gain, you're fulfilling the demands of the political machine. You're fulfilling the demands of the corporation, but you're not fulfilling the demands of Christ. And in fact, you're going directly against it by lying to a fellow Christian. And it goes down the line. There are traits that one has to possess and cultivate to be successful in these highly competitive spheres. And oftentimes they're in complete contradistinction to, say, Paul's fruits of the Spirit or Christ's commandments in the Sermon on the Mount. And so you end up with Christians who have fallen into the Machiavellian trap of the ends justify the means. They end up cease being Christian in the process by which they seek to take over these institutions, because the only way that they can take over those institutions is by playing by those institutional rules, which are diametrically opposed to the revealed. And again, let's not just limit this to the New Testament. It's diametrically opposed to the Tanakh and the law of Moses as well. You can't be successful in these areas and to use the theonomist language, be a covenant keeper. And that's the real problem, is because there's this radical disconnect with these people, which has given rise to an unfortunate but I think accurate assessment that many Christians are just hypocrites, because they'll say one thing and do the exact opposite later.
Well, let me give you another example, this time within the business realm. ChickfilA. ChickfilA was founded by Truett Cathy, a man who was a devout Baptist and who was under the conviction that he shouldn't do business on Sunday for his restaurant. Now, in the American South, if anybody in the audience has been there or is from there, you'll know that Sunday is one of the most profitable times for restaurants, because a lot of people are coming out of church and they want to have dinner, they want to have lunch, and so they'll go by restaurants. And so it's not uncommon for a lot of restaurants here in particularly rural areas to actually be closed on Monday, because Monday is their effective day of rest, interestingly enough. So, but the thing is, he was taking a significant business risk especially in his region, by not opening on Sunday. And as a result, he still was able to grow a very successful business. And today, ChickfilA has some of the highest marks in customer satisfactions and customer loyalty. And they've become a benchmark for many people within the industry, not just within the fast food industry, but in other industries as well, as companies seek to become the Chick-fil-A of their chosen industry. So they can't be faulted for that. But Cathy was very insistent that the company remain within family hands, that it would not be sold to investors or taken for an initial public offering, because he feared that if this was publicly traded in a publicly owned company, that a lot of the values that he attempted to instill into Chick-fil-A would be lost, and there would be a temptation for a downgrade. Now, at his death a couple of years ago, he made his children sign a covenant that they would never take the company public. And so far, they have remained true to that. So the Cathy family is still very much in control. of Chick-fil-A. The problem is that as Chick-fil-A has grown and they've moved out from the South and more into liberal urban centers, places like New York City, places like Chicago, and even fairly recently into Toronto in the United Kingdom, they have faced a lot of opposition from the mayors of those cities and residents of those cities who claim, because of the Christian stances taken by Dan Cathy, Troy Cathy's son, has disqualified it from ever being in that city, for purported homophobia. Now, the result has only been in more business. People still go to Chick-fil-A and they're still quite profitable. However, recently, when they tried to open up a store in Reading, in England, there was a lot of pressure on the mall to let them out of their lease, which is what the mall did. And so their attempt to go across the pond failed because of pressure from pro-homosexual groups. And recently, Chick-fil-A has done, perhaps as a course correction, has defunded a lot of the charities that they have supported, like Fellowship of Christian Athletes and the Salvation Army, purportedly homophobic organizations, and have channeled that money to, of all places, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And recently, Dan Cathy has gone on the woke train by shining Lecrae's shoes, and made statements on that. And you kind of wonder, what happened to Chick-fil-A to do all this? Well, the thing is that Chick-fil-A, despite the fact that it is owned by a family and not owned by a board of trustees or a board of investors, they still are slaves, if I can use that word, to a growth mentality. The Cathys are still running their business very much like they would if this were a publicly traded company, in terms of more profit, more growth, more expansion. And what this does, of course, is even though they may not be answerable to a board of governors or outside of themselves, they are still in that mindset of wanting more and more and more and more. And that in and of itself has corrupted a lot of the values that their founder purportedly had. And so Chick-fil-A seems to be going in a very leftward direction culturally now as well. Now, time will tell to see if that will actually hurt them in the long run or if that will help them. But the point being is that, I think, as you mentioned, is that it's very difficult to maintain some of the world's mindsets, such as indefinite growth, without having to make significant moral compromises, even if you adjust it to say, like, again, if you keep a business like that in the family, or if you try to make certain modifications to avoid some of these things. If you're playing the game of the world like that, it's only inevitable that you will have to bend to the world's rules. And we're seeing that now, even with purported stalwarts like Chick-fil-A, and I'm pretty sure that other businesses that are purportedly Christian in their orientation or in their founding will likely take a similar approach.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of the joke, right, is that for all of their rhetoric about antinomianism, when it comes to economics, that's exactly what the right-wing dominionists are. They're antinomian, because if you read the Tanakh, you're not supposed to charge usury at interest to a fellow Israelite, and they'll be, and then they might make an appeal to the exception clause to a foreigner. Yeah, but again, you're lending to fellow Americans. It doesn't say if this fellow Israelite doesn't necessarily follow Yahweh, because one can imagine, especially later on, like when Israel and Judah split, that law to not lend to a brother at interest would probably still hold if a Judean merchant were selling goods in Naphtali, even though they were worshiping a perverted version of Yahwism. So, again, that doesn't cut it even that way. Furthermore, the other economic restrictions on growth with the Jubilee mindset, they don't put that into practice. They don't even talk about it, to be honest. And when it comes to surety for a loan, especially a poor man, if he has to, give up some article of clothing or some article necessary for his own sustenance, you're not to withhold it from him if he needs it. I think we would not ever see a neo-Calvinist do that. And yet that's what the law would require. And one thing that they do that's rather creative to get out of keeping all of the law is, some of it was just uniquely special to Israel itself and not a part of the moral law. But I mean, if we look at the original teaching of economics, it was a subset of moral philosophy. So to argue that economics isn't a part of the moral law and is part of some unique law given to Israel is just patently absurd, because I mean, the guy they love to quote so much, R.L. Dabney, taught economics as moral philosophy. So yeah, you can't make that distinction, and they're not treating that law seriously. Now, by the same token, you'll see left-wing theonomists appeal to the prophets and some of what they say, which can be utilized by social justice advocates, also failed to realize that, well, what exactly are the prophets hearkening to? Well, they're hearkening back to the law that Moses was given, which a lot of these people are ashamed of. A lot of these progressive Christians would not want to have a Mosaic state. So again, they're appealing only half-heartedly to this principle, and it's really without law, because they both bring in secular antichrist perspectives that have, I mean, you're either rooted, you either have an economic system or theory rooted in the scriptures, or you don't. And if you don't, that's called syncretism.
Exactly. Now, one thing that I do appreciate about Rushdoony, even if he failed in doing so, or at least in a consistent manner, was bring up the issue of epistemology in a way that a lot of Christians today really don't think about. We don't really think about where we get our knowledge, how we process knowledge. We just assume a lot of things are, and that's indicative of human beings throughout history. Most people don't really examine their worldviews in such a way. But even if I were to disagree with some of his, Ventilian presuppositionalism or total depravity, as Calvinists would understand it, I would commend him for saying that we need to have a worldview that's rooted in the Bible, and have an epistemology that's rooted in the Bible. So Solomon says, of course, in Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, that carries with it the supposition that there is a God, that he is a God that is worth fearing. That means whether that means respect, and probably also within that idea that he is powerful. And I would say by extension, in other words, he is just. And because he is powerful and just, we live in subjection to him, and we are accountable to him. So that should cause us to fear, right? So we should live in fear, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, I think, as Paul says, understanding that we serve a just God, and that this just God will call us to account in the next life. So with that in mind, you can't really take this worldview that is essentially rooted in an active theistic, an active, just, moralistic, theistic position, and fuse it with either Marxism or libertarianism, because both of those ideas are rooted in secular, atheistic, naturalistic assumptions. So, for example, Rothbard and others assume that man owns himself, which is ludicrous on the face of it. That flies against the idea that God owns everything, and even Paul says specifically about Christians that we were bought at a price. We can't really go with Marx because, of course, Marx explicitly rejects religion, and he believes that all hierarchy is bad, all hierarchy is inevitably evil, and all of history is a series of class conflicts. The Bible teaches that there's some hierarchy that is just, and that really the history of man is man trying to struggle away from God, not so much with regardless of class. So those two assumptions cannot fit with the Bible. They cannot. And this is a true instance in either case of being unequally yoked, where when you have people on the right and the left that are more comfortable with secularists on their side than they are with Christians that may oppose them, that kind of tells you like what's losing out. It's not the libertarianism that has to be modified to fit Christianity. It's the Christianity that has to be modified. And the same thing with Marxism.
Yeah, exactly. And the other problem that we see developing is, well, this is actually an insight from people like Rushdoony and Bahnsen. The internal contradictions of positions always work themselves out. And they said that with regards to the secular assumptions of the secular world. And we're seeing America increasingly fragment and become politically more unstable. But I think we can also argue that with the right and left forms of dominionism, we also are seeing the contradictions unraveling there as well, because Christianity does not make easy bedfellows with libertarianism or communism. And what ends up happening is that there are subtle changes that happen in each of these groups that make these compromises. And I think the obvious example of the logic working out in compromise for the left-wing dominionists is their extremely pathetic view of personal piety, where, sexual sin and other kinds of sin, such as like envy and anger, are just sort of par for the course. The angry left-wing radical, the envious left-wing radical, the lustful left-wing radical, all of those things are just sort of almost indistinguishable from many quote-unquote left-wing Christians. And the right-wing theonomists, you could argue that, well, yeah, for them, the inner logic of capitalism has won out, so they're often perceived with some, I think, justification as hard-hearted, money hungry, always looking to make a profit at someone else's expense. People are just means to an end to extract value from. And so you're right. What we actually see in the lives of these Christians is not that their secular libertarian or socialist friends are becoming more Christ-like. Far from it. We see them becoming more like libertarians and socialists, which just feeds into the idea that many who are not Christians who look in will say, oh, well, these Christians are just hypocrites. They don't really believe anything. And it leads to a lot of infighting amongst Christians within the same denominations, right? They're in the same, they're not even different denominations. They're within the same denominations, maybe even within the same church. And that leads to, divisions within the church, which Paul says is a schism, and that will be judged as well. And so the inner logic is working itself out, and it's leaving both groups impotent to do anything.
And this is a frustration I have with right-wing dominionists, and is that right-wing dominionists, some of you that we've watched, Todd, has rightfully pointed out the hypocrisy that many of the sort of new left within Christianity, people within Big Eva, that are pushing this sort of neo-Marxist philosophy with critical race theory, or winking at it at the very least. What they don't realize is that the atmosphere that created this, in large part, was the already politicization of Christianity in the first place. The fact is that many within evangelical circles, not starting with Trump, but going much further, have supported the right wing and supported the Republican Party almost with giving them a carte blanche, which I think one of the biggest detriments to the development of Christianity, Christianity here in the United States, probably was the Iraq War, which the Iraq War damaged the legacy of Christianity in both the United States and the United Kingdom, because you had leaders that cited God as I get lack of a better word, an inspiration, or as a guiding force in their decision to invade Iraq. And of course, the results have been disastrous. And so they're right in pointing out that the Christian Right's alliance with the Republican Party has been disastrous for the gospel. But they propose just to do the same thing with the Democratic Party, the party that, for which the Republican Party is not that great, but the Democratic Party at this stage is advocating for the transition of prepubescent children into different genders, abortion on demand, in some cases even in the fourth trimester. The party that supports indefinite lockdowns that keep these churches closed, in that you wonder, are they making the same mistake, assuming that these people are honest actors? The fact is that neither side in the dominionist argument is willing to say that perhaps our involvement in politics as a whole has been detrimental to our witness, or at the very least, attaching ourselves to one party or the other. And I think that the sad thing is that whatever happens, that whenever this particular form of political Christianity, whether it's the right or the left, falls out of favor, a significant part of the church is going to be taken out with it. So I think it's, when it comes to Christians, we might do with a little bit of pietism, so to speak, in keeping ourselves unstained from the world.
Exactly. And the other element as well is that these prior attempts at taking dominion have failed, and it just leads to more and more black eyes, and it just gives opponents to dominionism more and more ammunition to use against it. And it also shows, I think, a fundamentally profound unwillingness to look at, honestly, the failures of the past that each group has, and then work from that to a better future solution. So again, for example, if you look at, say, the Constitutional Convention, the founding fathers looked at prior examples in European history of self-government, and they said, okay, well, what worked and what didn't work? What can we learn from the failures of self-government in the past? How can we create a new system that will preserve those aspects of self-government that we thought were really great about Greece and Rome and certain medieval states, but hedge against what destroyed them historically? And they had a very hard-nosed look at all of these prior things. And you look at today, and most people who are dominionists don't really do that. It's almost like they actually forgot the previous failure happened. And so it just seems profoundly unserious to me.
It does. And it does seemingly become just a cover for already existing worldly philosophies that they have already predetermined that they believe. And so, which is why this new crop of left-wing Christians, I don't really think have added, especially among purportedly conservative Christians, those that have emerged, particularly from the new Calvinism that has been here in the early 21st century, really hasn't been helpful in that regard. In fact, they seem to be just chasing current trends, much like their previous forebears of Christians have chased political trends. And of course, that proves disastrous. There's already indications that people within quote unquote Big Eva may be ready for a pivot to the right should Donald Trump win. And that kind of shows you again how fundamentally unserious many of these people are. And again, I think if Christianity in general, especially within evangelical circles, whether they are Calvinist or not, need to eject dominionism if we are going to really reclaim any level of seriousness in our witness. If we are constantly concerned with trying to take over human institutions, which in order to do so we have to play by their rules, we're going to further damage our witness as hypocrites, regardless of how you slice it. And that's going to, in the end, destroy our witness and destroy our effectiveness in reaching a lost world.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of think we covered the topic. Is there anything else you felt that we missed?
None that come to mind. Just to say is that as Christians, we have a lot to look forward to in the next life. That doesn't mean that we are absolved from doing anything here and now. As Christians, we do have a lot to do here and now. And the Bible outlines what we're to do here and now. However, I think as we talked about last week, our immediate focus should be on those around us. It should be on our churches, our families, our local communities. And the Bible gives us some very explicit directions in that and how we treat our neighbor. The Bible doesn't give us that much ambiguity in the Old or New Testaments. And if we're going to be that witness and change our world in the way that purportedly people like dominionists on either side claim to do, we would be best to maybe to get in our closets and to start praying and reading our Bible. And that will manifest itself in works that we do in our community.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Master Sanders. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.